80 tons of Krupp steel were supposed to be the final word in the conquest of North Africa. On February the 26th, 1943, Hitler's most feared predators emerged from the Tunisian mist. Certain the Allied line would fold, but they didn't anticipate General George S. Patton, a commander who arrived not to defend, but to keep a terrifying promise. He was about to transform the field gun into a mechanized saber that would hunt down every Tiger tank in the desert. The Tunisian winter of 1943 was a crucible of cold mud and jagged rock, a landscape where the expansive maneuvers of the desert gave way to the claustrophobic terror of mountain warfare. Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, stood over his maps with a chilling confidence that bordered on arrogance. To his eyes, the Allied forces were a collection of amateurs. The Americans were physically soft, and the British First Army was overextended and weary. Von Arnim's assessment, shared by many in the Wehrmacht High Command, was that the Anglo-American alliance would fold the moment a real weight was applied to their spine. He conceived Operation Ochsenkopf, the Oxhead Offensive, a brutal three-pronged thrust designed to gore the Allied lines and seize the critical road junction at Beja. If Beja fell, the entire Allied northern flank would collapse, and the race to Tunis would end in a watery grave for the defenders. As the dawn of late February broke, the northern horn of von Arnim's bull began to move. A lethal armored fist centered around the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion. Within this unit lurked the first Tiger I tanks to see significant action in North Africa. Beasts of Krupp steel, armed with the legendary 88mm gun. The route to Beja was a narrow secondary road snaking through a broad valley, a bottleneck that the desert fox, Erwin Rommel, had warned was a tactical trap. But von Arnim was a man of the traditional Prussian school. He believed that mass and momentum would overcome geography. The first obstacle in their path was the railway station at Sidi Nsir, a cluster of stone hovels held by the 5th Battalion of the Royal Hampshire Regiment and the 155th Battery of the 172nd Field Regiment, Royal Artillery. These men were essentially a speed bump in the path of a steamroller, but as the war diaries held in the National Archives at Kew attest, they were a speed bump made of iron. The engagement at Sidi Nsir was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a sacrifice. Major John Smith Raworth, commander of the 155th Battery, looked through his optics to see a long, dark line of 77 German tanks emerging from the morning mist. Among them were 14 Tigers, their massive silhouettes unmistakable. The British gunners were equipped with the 25-pounder field gun, a versatile weapon, but one never intended to duel the heaviest armor on Earth at point-blank range. Yet as the German tanks blundered into a minefield, the 155th opened a firestorm that shattered the silence of the valley. The air was soon thick with the screams of Messerschmitts and the thud of 80mm mortar rounds. According to the memoirs of Jack Linenbat, a survivor of the 155th, the British gunners were forced into a direct fire roll, lowering their muzzles to sight over open barrels at the oncoming steel wall. This was the first tactical mystery of the campaign. How could these freshman units hold their ground against the elite of the 10th Panzer Division? The answer lay in a refusal to blink. One 25-pounder crew fired until a Tiger was within 30 yards. The kinetic energy of their shells causing internal spalling that turned the inside of the German tanks into a whirlwind of shrapnel. By mid-afternoon, the road was a bottleneck of burning German vehicles, but the cost was total. The battery's observation posts were incinerated, their telephone lines shredded, and their ammunition trucks set ablaze. As the sun dipped behind the Jebels, the final German assault surged into the heart of the British position. The last message from the 155th Battery was not a plea for help, but a defiant V for victory in Morse code, tapped out as German tracks began to crush the very guns they were firing. Of the 130 officers and men who started the day at Sidi Nsir, only 9 emerged from the hills. They had bought 48 hours with their lives, time that the Allied command used to reinforce the bottleneck at Hunt's Gap. The delay at Sidi Nsir funneled von Arnim's remaining Tigers into a killing zone. At Hunt's Gap, the terrain became a quagmire. Heavy seasonal rains turned the valley floor into a trap of sticky black mud that the heavy German machines could not navigate. Here, the British Churchills and massed artillery regiments were waiting. It was a scene of industrial-scale slaughter. The German tanks, restricted to the single road, became sitting ducks for a prolonged artillery barrage that did not just target the tanks, but the very earth they sat on. The aftermath at Beja was what the declassified reports call a Panzer graveyard. 19 Tigers, nearly 90% of the 501st's operational strength, were left as twisted, rusted monuments in the mud. Major Hans-Georg Lutter, the battalion's commander, was severely wounded, and his unit effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. This was the historical enigma that confounded the Germans. They had superior armor and veteran crews, yet they had been dismantled by a freshman force using geography and mass fire as a primary offensive weapon. But the tactical evolution of the Allies was only beginning. While the British were holding the line at Beja, the American Second Corps was suffering from a profound crisis of confidence following the debacle at Kasserine Pass. The troops were demoralized, the leadership was defensive-minded, and the Tiger Terror was real. On March 6, 1943, a shadow fell over the American headquarters, a shadow wearing a polished helmet and carrying an ivory-handled revolver. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. had arrived to take command of a broken army. Patton did not arrive as an administrator. He arrived as a master of the sword. To Patton, a cavalryman at heart who had designed the M1913 saber, the problem was not the men, it was the spirit. He saw the tank as a modern horse and the artillery as a mechanized charge. His first move was to instill what he called the cavalry spirit, a relentless, aggressive posture that favored the thrust over the parry. He initiated the Beanie Campaign, a series of vexatious disciplinary rules requiring ties, leggings, and helmets at all times, even in the latrines. He was kicking Second Corps in the butt to remind them that the era of defensive thinking was over. Patton's leadership secret was his belief in the synergy of combat power. He viewed the battlefield not as a series of isolated duels, but as a synchronized team of armor, air, and artillery. He famously summarized his doctrine as, grab them by the nose and kick them in the pants. The infantry and localized artillery would be the nose, fixing the enemy in a brutal frontal struggle, while the mobile armor and massed heavy guns would be the pants, swinging around to strike the rear with terrifying violence. As he sat with Major General Terry Allen, the firebrand commander of the 1st Infantry Division, Patton made it clear. He expected to see officer casualties as proof of a serious effort. The Americans were about to stop being freshmen and start becoming the hammer of the North African front. The transition from the desperate heroism at Sidi Nsir to the disciplined mass of Patton's command represented a tectonic shift in Allied military philosophy. At the heart of this revolution was a technical mastery of ballistics and logistics. Patton demanded that his artillery brigades be ruthless and massed. Unlike the previous defensive mindset where batteries were parceled out to protect individual infantry lines, Patton centralized command and control. This allowed for the simultaneous concentration of fire from multiple battalions on a single point of the German line. He was moving toward a strategy where firepower would not just support the maneuver, but become the maneuver itself. This aggression was fueled by a deep understanding of information advantage. Patton utilized air liaison officers and forward observers to identify German armored assembly areas long before they reached the front lines. By integrating tactical air support with his heavy artillery, he created a synchronized team that could strike the enemy at every depth of the battlefield. The German commanders, who relied on speed and wide-ranging envelopment, found themselves hampered by a general who used heavy guns to canalize them into minefields and prepared fire zones. As the spring of 1943 approached, the strategic landscape was set for a final confrontation. Von Arnim, having failed to achieve his objectives during Operation Ochsenkopf, remained convinced that the Americans would crumble under pressure. He did not anticipate the arrival of a commander like Patton, who would meet German aggression with even greater violence. The stage was now set for El Guettar, the battle that would serve as the ultimate validation of the tactical lessons learned in the mud of Beja. The spring of 1943 was not just a change in season, it was the birth of the American Blitzkrieg. Patton's arrival had signaled a fundamental transformation in how the Allied armies projected force. While the victory at Beja had been a defensive masterpiece of British grit, Patton intended to use the upcoming engagement at El Guettar to prove that the American soldier was no longer a freshman, but a master of the mechanized hammer. He understood that to defeat an elite enemy like the 10th Panzer Division, one had to move beyond the reactionary tactics of the past. The tactical secret lay in the aggressive application of massed fire, a concept he had refined from his years in the cavalry, where the momentum of the charge was the primary instrument of victory. Von Arnim, however, was convinced. He viewed Patton's aggressive posturing as the bluster of a cowboy general. The German commander ordered the 10th Panzer Division, a veteran unit of the Eastern Front, to launch a massive counterattack to clear the pass at El Guettar. They expected to find the same panicked Americans they had routed at Kasserine just weeks earlier. The German strategy was simple: a fast, heavy thrust designed to break the Allied spine and restore the initiative to the Axis forces. They did not realize that the U.S. Second Corps they were about to encounter was a completely different animal, reorganized and re-energized by Patton's iron discipline and his insistence on a cavalry spirit. On the morning of March the 23rd, 50 panzers emerged from the dusty shroud of the El Guettar Valley. They moved in a classic three-sided screen, followed by half-tracks of panzer grenadiers. It was a terrifying sight for any soldier, the rhythmic clatter of tracks echoing off the canyon walls. But Patton had anticipated the thrust. He had positioned the 1st Infantry Division's artillery and the 601st and 776th Tank Destroyer Battalions in a horseshoe formation. He was playing a high-stakes game of luring the enemy into a pocket, waiting for the moment when their momentum would carry them into a killing zone of his own making. As the German tanks reached the center of the valley, they triggered a time-on-target barrage. This was Patton's tactical masterpiece. In a TOT mission, every gun in the Corps, from light 105mm howitzers to the heavy 155mm long toms, synchronizes its fire so that every shell arrives at the target at the exact same second. The result was a physical and psychological firestorm that no armored formation could endure. The German panzers were not just hit, they were engulfed. The silence of the morning was replaced by a continuous rolling thunder that shook the very foundations of the earth. Patton watched the devastation from a forward observation post, his binoculars fixed on the chaos below. He noted with a grim satisfaction that his tank destroyer crews were not hiding in the shadows or relying on concealment. They were maneuvering in the open, rushing the panzers to engage at point-blank range. It was a mechanized cavalry charge, a thrust that left 30 German tanks burning in the valley within a single hour. He saw German infantrymen being cut down by artillery fire alongside their crippled tanks, a sight that confirmed his belief that the era of defensive thinking was dead. The technical evolution of this hammer was rooted in the logistical mastery Patton demanded. In the tortuous mountain roads of Tunisia, where the paths were often no more than mud-choked trails, his teams moved thousands of tons of shells to forward positions. He viewed fuel and ammunition as the lifeblood of maneuver, ensuring that the guns never fell silent. This was not just about weight of fire, it was about suppression. The high-explosive shells landing near a panzer could exceed the structural limits of the hull, creating pressure waves that blinded optical sights and rendered the superior 88mm guns useless. By midday, the 10th Panzer Division had been forced to pull back to reorganize. The American victory was not yet complete, but the psychological tide had turned. The German commanders who had seen American forces crumble at Kasserine were now facing a force that could learn, adapt, and beat the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. Patton had restored the faith of his soldiers, proving that American ingenuity and aggression could overcome the quality of German armor. The historical enigma of the freshman army was being solved in the fire of El Guettar. Intercepted German communications soon indicated that a new attack was planned for the late afternoon. This time, the 10th Panzer Division put their infantry forward, hoping that foot soldiers could navigate the terrain and clear the American artillery positions. But the American observers were waiting. They had the range and waited patiently for the enemy to close within 1,500 yards. When the moment came and another methodical bombardment tore the formation apart. This was the synergy of combat power in action, a synchronized strike that left the survivors with no choice but to retreat toward Gabes. The ambitions of von Arnim were effectively crushed in the valleys of Tunisia. By late March, the 5th Panzer Army had lost 90% of its heavy tanks in the northern and central sectors. The strategic initiative had passed firmly to the Allies. Patton's ingenious use of heavy artillery had turned the traditionally defensive field gun into a terrifying offensive weapon of conquest. He had taken the disparate elements of the Allied arsenal, tanks, infantry, air support, and artillery, and forged them into a singular, devastating weapon of maneuver. The aftermath of El Guettar revealed the true cost of von Arnim's arrogance. The loss of nearly 5,000 elite German personnel during Operation Ochsenkopf represented men who could not be easily replaced. Furthermore, because von Arnim was forced to commit his mobile reserves to counter Patton's offensive, Rommel was left without the necessary support to hold the Meerut line against Montgomery. The Axis bridgehead in North Africa was collapsing, caught in a strategic vice that was being tightened by the relentless application of firepower and maneuver. As the final drive on Tunis and Bizerte began, Patton was already looking toward the next horizon, Sicily. He had taken a demoralized corps and forged it into a world-class fighting force. He had demonstrated that the future of war was not in isolated tank duels, but in the integration of all arms into a single cohesive team. The legacy of Béja and El Guettar would carry the Allies from the mountains of North Africa to the heart of Berlin, a testament to the general who saw the future of the sword in the muzzle of a howitzer. What if Patton had not arrived to take command? The alternate reality is a chilling one. Without his insistence on the cavalry spirit and his revolutionary use of massed artillery, the U.S. Second Corps might have remained a defensive, timid force, easily picked apart by von Arnim's veteran Panzer divisions. The race to Tunis would have been prolonged, and the Axis might have maintained their toehold on the African continent for months longer, potentially altering the timing and success of the eventual invasion of Europe. The Battle of Béja was more than a tactical engagement. It was the birthplace of the modern American way of war. The transition from the localized heroism of the 155th Battery at Sidi Nsir to the disciplined, massed firepower of Patton's Second Corps marked the end of an era. It was the moment when the Allies mastered the laboratory of mechanized warfare, transitioning from the shock of initial defeat to the mastery of combined arms operations. Patton's ability to restore mobility through the overwhelming application of fire remains the cornerstone of modern tactical doctrine. In the final analysis, the destruction of the 5th Panzer Army's ambitions was not a result of superior numbers alone, but of a superior understanding of the relationship between time, space, and firepower. George S. Patton Jr. had seen that in the age of the Panzer, the only way to achieve decisive victory was to grab the enemy by the nose and kick them in the pants with the full weight of the artillery's hammer. He had decapitated the bull of von Arnim, ensuring that the Axis would never again hold the initiative in North Africa. The sandy ridges of central Tunisia still bear silent witness to the day America's soldiers refused to run. This is a story from World War II, a narrative of transformation and the terrifying evolution of firepower. It is a story of how General George S. Patton Jr. and Major General Terry Allen took a broken army and turned it into the sword of democracy. But as we look back at the charred wrecks of the Tiger tanks at Hunt's Gap, we must ask ourselves, was it Patton's genius that won the day? Or was it the sacrifice of the nameless gunners who refused to blink in the face of the steel wall? If you were a commander in the Tunisian Jebels, would you have prioritized the defensive grit of the 155th Battery or Patton's aggressive, offensive spirit to stop the Tigers? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.